Okay, everybody, welcome back to the online video lecture series for Philosophy 102 Ethics. In this video, we're going to return to Kant's moral theory, and in particular, the main purpose of this video will be to explain what philosophers now call Kant's principle of humanity. Now, before we get to what this principle is, I want to just take a moment to remind ourselves of the basic schema that we set out at first when we looked at Kant's moral philosophy. We said that Kant's moral philosophy is a sort of deontology. It's a kind of ethics that emphasizes the importance of duty, of following absolute moral rules. And up to this point, we've really been focused on the absolutist part of his theory. This idea that there are certain moral rules that just should not be broken. But I also told you there's another aspect of his theory, and I'm referring to this aspect as the idea that we have to show respect for persons. So what does this mean? Well, in general, the idea of a moral requirement of respect for persons means there's something about human beings, and really more specifically, rational beings, that makes them unlike anything else that exists. And because they're unlike anything else that exists, because they have this ability to reason, which we've seen is critical for Kant, you can't follow the categorical imperative without reason. You can't understand the difference between an action that only you can do versus a universalizable action without reason. So because rational beings have that ability, they have this special status, and because they have that special status, we have to treat rational beings with a certain sort of respect, a certain sort of, he used the word dignity. And in order to get sort of a handle on this idea of respect for persons, I want to take a moment to reflect on the notion of respect itself. And there are a couple of things I want to bring out. And so it's important to first get in your mind, if you say, I respect another individual, I respect another person, what is the sort of attitude or feeling that you have toward them? Now, the first thing to say is that respect is one sort of positive attitude. It's some sort of positive feeling. And we have many positive feelings. We might love someone, we might admire someone, we might be hopeful for another person, we might like somebody, right? These are all positive attitudes or feelings we have toward another person. And of course, there are negative ones. There's hate, there's dislike, there is resentment, right? These are all negative feelings. So respect is some sort of positive feeling or attitude we have toward another. But what's interesting about respect is when you sort of start to think about it in relation to our other positive and negative attitudes. To see what I mean, compare, for instance, love and hate. Now, of course, it's very common to say, you have a love-hate relationship with someone. And this sort of implies that, you love and hate that person at the same time. And we've all, of course, felt that way at times. There are people who we love very much and care about in our lives, but they also annoy us. They also maybe anger us. And they also maybe do things that we really think are bad. So we have this phrase, love-hate relationship. But I'm not sure how literally we should really take that. And what I mean is think seriously about, is it really possible to love and hate someone at the same time? I mean, one plausible way of thinking about love is if you love another person, you want what's best for them. If you hate another person, you probably want what is worse for them. And those two things just simply don't seem like they can go together. It doesn't seem like you can really love and hate someone at the same time. At least in my view, I think that when we talk about having a love-hate relationship, usually we're talking about something we really do care about, but who disappoints us or angers us with some degree of regularity. But if you really love that person, it's very unlikely you actually also hate them, that you really want the worst for them. And the only reason I bring this up is because this shows that the positive attitude of love and the negative one of hate don't really go together very well. They don't really mesh. But now think about respect. So think about the attitude of respect and think about how that might go together with hatred, with dislike. So for instance, imagine you are someone who's convicted of a crime. right? You committed a crime, you were convicted, and the judge gives you your sentence. Now, this is actually very unlikely because in most cases, the most common human emotion to the situation would be resentment. You would be angry and resentful that the judge gave you this sentence. But let's say you recognize you did something wrong, you understand you did something wrong, and you actually want to accept what you think is a fair and just punishment. There might be a part of you which shows respect for the status of the judge and even respect for the judgment that the judge makes. You might say, look, I understand that this person has the authority to do this, they're doing their job correctly, and this is the punishment I deserve. At the same time, there might be a part of you that genuinely hates or at least dislikes the judge who is giving you the sentence. There's a funny way in which, although love and hate, like and dislike, don't really seem to go together all that well, respect is perfectly compatible with negative emotions. You can respect someone and dislike them. You can respect someone and be annoyed by them. You can respect someone and maybe even hate them. You might think about it in a competitive athletic context, right? You might say, look, this rival team from across the town, I really dislike them. I have no real good feelings about them. I might even hate them. But you might also respect their talent. You might respect their game. You might say, wow, I have to respect how good they are at their craft, and if they beat us, then I respect the job they did. This is, of course, exactly why you see at the end of sports games, you'll see teams shaking hands, even if it was a bitterly fought game between two heated and hated rivals. So the first thing to say about respect is it's a positive attitude, but it's not like other positive attitudes. It's not primarily emotional. It's not primarily personal. When you say you respect another person, you're saying something about what they deserve, what they're worth, and not primarily something about how you personally feel about them. Now, there's another aspect of this that matters as well. You might say, well, how is that possible? When we show respect to someone, if we're not making a statement about our personal feelings, then where does this good attitude, where does the positive feeling or affect come from? Well, so think about another aspect of respect. And maybe the best example of this is if you look in a military context, because in the military, everyone has their rank, they know who they answer to, there's a chain of command, etc., etc. And you might say, well, you're supposed to respect your superiors. And why are you supposed to respect your superiors? Well, the idea is they have a certain status. They've attained a certain level, and so you are supposed to recognize and you're supposed to recognize that status by showing respect for that individual. The same thing with a teacher and students in class. There's a reason the teacher's in front of the room speaking to the class, and the students are facing the other way in the chairs. It's a recognition of the expertise the teacher has that they should be in that role, and you show respect to the teacher by recognizing that role. So a few things about respect. There's 2 points here. First, respect is a positive attitude, but that's not primarily personal, and it's a recognition of status. So what does this mean for ethics, right? When Kant says that we have a fundamental duty to respect human beings, what is he saying? Is he requiring us to like all other human beings or rational beings or love them? No. He's not requiring any personal feelings from you. Instead, he's saying that rational beings have a certain status, and whether you like any other person you meet or not, whether you love them or hate them, you have to respect that status. But then you might wonder, where did that status come from? How did they get that status? I mean, in the military, you have your rank, and you move up the chain of command by showing you're competent in your job. The teacher gains status by getting the relevant degrees, being hired to the position by those who are in charge. Where does just any human being get their status? How can we just say every person, every human being, every rational individual warrants respect? For Kant, it is because we possess reason. It's because we have this special ability to reason, it's because we have this ability to use, as we said in our previous videos, practical reason. It's because that is unique to us that this gives us a certain status. So all human beings, all rational beings, no matter if you're short or tall, smart or stupid, fast or slow, strong or weak, doesn't matter. No matter your race, your religion, your gender, where you were born, every single human being deserves a status and then therefore deserves respect. And so this idea that Kant is getting at is often seen to underline views about human rights. It's this idea that all human beings, because of their status as a rational being, deserve certain sorts of treatment, certain kinds of rights. Okay, so we have a little better idea of what it means to respect another individual. Now, how does Kant actually express this? So, and specifically, what is this principle, what I'm calling and what's generally called the principle of humanity? What is the principle of humanity telling us? It's primarily telling us what does it mean to respect another person. And I'm just going to go to the more simple way that Kant expresses this principle. He says, so act that you use humanity in your own person as well as in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. Okay, well, just like the principle of the categorical imperative, this seems like a bit of a mouthful. It seems like some abstract philosophizing, so let's go ahead and break it down into its component parts. What the principle of humanity is telling us is how we can and cannot treat other people. That's the simplest way to put it. And there are three parts. I've highlighted them in different colors, so I want to start with the last part. He says, so act that you use humanity never merely as a means. Okay, so let's call this the mere means prohibition. And what it's saying is we are prohibited from using human beings or rational beings as a mere means to an end. Okay, now the general idea might be clear enough. Don't use people. Right? Don't use other people as mere objects to get what you want for some greater end. Now, we'll have more to say about why we shouldn't treat people in that way. But let's get a little clearer idea, because notice that Kant says you should never merely use someone as a means. That means there might be some ways in which we can use others for our purposes that are appropriate, and some ways of doing so which would not be appropriate. So think about the following examples. So case 1. Rachel enslaves Ryan and forces him upon threat of death to perform hard physical labor. In this case, in case 1, Rachel would clearly be using Ryan as a mere means to an end. Ryan was given no choice, no autonomy. I wasn't allowed to think about whether doing this labor was in accordance with my values or not. I was simply forced to do it. On the other hand, consider case 2. Rachel hires Ryan to teach Philosophy 102 at Grand Valley State University. In that case, Rachel would not be using Ryan as a mere means. Now, Rachel might be using Ryan as a means in some sense, right? Rachel needs this class taught. She needs someone to do it. So she's going to use Ryan and his skills and expertise to get the job done. But she's not using him merely as a means, because Ryan wasn't forced. Ryan was allowed to sign the contract saying he would do the job or not sign it. So the first thing to think about when you look at these first two cases is, for Kant, when we think about using someone merely as a means, the question is, are you treating that being as a being with a will, with freedom, with autonomy, with the ability to make choices and use practical reason? Or are you treating them as an object? In case 1, where Rachel enslaves Ryan, she's clearly using Ryan as an object, not taking into account that Ryan is a person with a will that needs to be respected. That's not the case, however, in case 2. There, Rachel allows Ryan the choice necessary, respects that he's a being with a will who can choose to take the employment or not, and so does not use him merely as a means. So this is certainly a large part of what it means, what the mere means prohibition implies. Now, just to be clear, it's not always going to be so cut and dry whether an action uses someone as a means or a mere means. So consider case 3, for instance. Ryan is in destitute poverty and desperate to do whatever he can to survive. Rachel offers him work in a factory that involves long hours, 14-hour days, dangerous working conditions, and little pay. Ryan agrees to work at that factory. Now, of course, you might recognize this as sort of getting at the ethical controversy of sweatshop labor. And some people have argued that sweatshop labor, for instance, is an instance where the employers are using the employees as a mere means to an end. And why would that be? Well, they say it's exploitation. And of course one can say, well, look, didn't they, of their own free will, agree to work in this factory, work this dangerous job? And in a sense, yes. And so one could say, well, they're not being used as a mere means. On the other hand, if we think about the conditions under which the choice is being made, in destitute poverty, desperate to do whatever one can do to survive, we might wonder whether the choice made really was fully autonomous, really was fully rational. Now, my purpose in bringing this up is not to sort of decide this controversy here. I just want to bring up the idea that in some cases it won't be clear. Did the person autonomously and freely agree to do the action, or were they forced or coerced in some way? Okay, but that's the mere means prohibition. We cannot use people as a mere means to another end. Let's look at the second part, which I have highlighted in blue. He also says, so act that you use humanity always at the same time as an end. So the mere means prohibition says this is how you're not allowed to use human beings. But what I'm calling the humanity as an end requirement tells us do we have to treat human beings? What is the sort of value or respect that we have to show them? And although we can never use another person merely as a means, we must treat them as an end. Or, as he puts it in another place, an end in itself. So what does that mean? What would it mean to say that rational beings are ends in themselves? Well, we've actually used the idea of end a lot in this class. For instance, Aristotle believes that there is a final end, a final good, that is eudaimonia. It is what we are all striving after. It is what makes sense of all our actions. And one of the points he made about eudaimonia, he said, well, it wouldn't make sense to sacrifice this for anything else. Right? It wouldn't make sense, for instance, although military victory is a good thing, it wouldn't make sense to sacrifice eudaimonia to get military victory. It wouldn't make sense to sacrifice doing what is good and right for a human life in order to win in war. Because winning in war was always a means to the end of eudaimonia. Now what Kant is saying here is that sort of absolute value that Aristotle put on eudaimonia, that Mill puts on the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain, that sort of absolute value, we must also put on other human beings. Every single human being is an end in him or herself. They have that sort of absolute importance. And the way that Kant described this, he sort of connected it with irreplaceability. He says, I'm talking about entities whose existence in itself is an end such that no other can be put in its place. So when we say you, as a human being, have a value as an end in yourself, we're saying there's nothing else we could replace you with that would get, a full compensation for you. We can say, of course, your life is extremely valuable and all that, but, if we just got rid of you and replaced you with, a really nice car or a wonderful vacation, then, that's a fair trade. Well, no, we wouldn't say that. Because there's something special about rational beings, about human beings. In fact, for Kant, we couldn't even replace you with another human being. Every single human being has their own inherent value or their own inherent worth, and the humanity as end requirement is simply saying that's how you ought to treat other people. And the way that Kant describes this, he says, look, everything that has a value either is a price or a dignity. So anything that can be traded away for a sort of fair market value, your car, your house, any sort of material possession you might have, we say it as a price. Because you may not be able to get fair value for it in any transaction, but theoretically you could. You could trade away your car, maybe if its fair market value is $10,000, you could trade away for $10,000 and nothing would be lost. But human beings, on the other hand, have a dignity. There is nothing that we could put in your place which would not cause an overall loss. It's impossible for you to have a fair market value. And look at the way Kant describes this. He says, what has a price can be replaced with something else as its equivalent, whereas what is elevated above price and hence allows of no equivalent has a dignity. Well, what's he saying here? Elevated above price. Does that mean you're worthless? Well, no, it's much more like the phrase priceless. When we say, for instance, that the experience you had on a great vacation or experience you had with another person is priceless, we don't mean it's worthless. We mean no matter how much money someone gave you, they can never replace that experience you had. There's something that special about it. And Kant thinks that human beings are just like that. That they're so important that there is no amount of material goods, there's no amount of anything else that you could exchange and produce a situation in which there was no loss. Human beings are priceless. They have dignity. Okay, so what's interesting about this is he uses, and we're going to get to the third component in a minute, but he uses the principle of humanity in the false promising case we talked about last time. In fact, he talks about 4 different examples, which he applies the categorical imperative to. And then when he gets to the principle of humanity, he goes through those examples again and explains how the principle of humanity gives us the same result. So remember the false promising case. It was this idea that, I'm really strapped for cash. I need some money right now. What I'm going to do is borrow some money, and promise I'll pay it back, but I know I'm never actually going to. So we saw last time that Kant thinks this is a sort of lie. It's not universalizable. He also says it violates the principle of humanity. So let's see what he says here. As far as necessary or owed duty to others is concerned, someone who has it in mind to make a lying promise to others will see at once that he wants to make use of another human being merely as a means, who does not at the same time contain in himself the end. For the one, and this is the critical part, for the one I want to use for my purposes by such a promise cannot possibly agree to my way of proceeding with him, and thus himself contain the end of this action. So what's Kant saying here? Well, he says, when you make a false promise, the other person cannot possibly agree to your way of proceeding. So think about it. You're going to borrow money. You tell the person, yeah, I'm going to pay it back, even though you never will. When that other person agrees to pay that money back, what are they agreeing to? They're agreeing to give you the money on the condition that you will repay them. They're proceeding along the assumption that they're going to get that money back at some point down the line. But of course, this is not true. You're never intending to give the money back. So you are convincing this person to do something for you on false pretenses. So when that other person agrees to lend you money, they haven't actually agreed to your plan. They've only agreed to the false plan that you've represented to them. And because they haven't really agreed to your plan, they haven't actually consented to what you're doing. It's not real consent, it's a forced or exploited or tricked consent. And for that reason, he says, you are using this other person for your purposes. So first of all, notice how this is related to the principle of humanity. You're using this person merely as a means. For them, they're just an ATM machine. They're just an object which you're going to try to manipulate to try to get the money you need out of. And if you're treating them just like an ATM machine, just like an object that you can use for money payouts, then clearly you're not respecting them as an end in themselves. You're not treating them with the sort of respect that would be required for a being with dignity. You're treating them like your car, like your house, like anything else that you can use for your purposes. But you can't use a human being for your own purposes. Okay, so we're starting to see what Kant means by this idea of respect. And there's one last part of this principle. Notice that Kant says, so act that you use humanity in your own person as well as in the person of any other. So thus far we've been talking about you have to show respect to other people, and of course you do on Kant's theory. However, for Kant it also matters that you show respect to yourself. Now, what does this mean? That means when you are thinking about how to treat yourself, your own person, you have to treat it with the same respect, the same dignity, the same importance that you would treat anyone else. And there are a couple of implications to this. So one of the other examples that Kant uses in his in the groundwork is this case of suicide. And we talked about this before, right? Someone who's contemplating ending their life, but does not do so, right? We said this is a person that would have, their action would have genuine moral worth for Kant. And at the time I said, well, you sort of have to assume for that example to make sense that suicide is morally wrong. That's a controversial claim. It's one that Kant thought was true. But here we see some indication of why Kant thinks suicide is morally wrong. So Kant says, if to escape from a troublesome condition he destroys himself, he makes use of a person merely as a means to preserve a bearable condition up to the end of life. So what is he saying? If someone ends their own life, then essentially what that person is doing is saying, okay, I'm going to end my life as a means to the end of reducing my own suffering, or as he puts it, having a bearable condition throughout my life. The end I want to achieve is having a more pleasant and less unpleasant, I suppose you would say, life. That's the end I'm trying to achieve, a more pleasant life. And I'm going to do that by using my own person as a means to that end. Namely, by destroying my life in order to attain that end. But he says this is morally wrong, because you are using yourself as a means to some other end. And you can't even use yourself in that way, let alone other people. Kant reiterates, a human being is not a thing, hence not something that can be used merely as a means, but must always be considered an end in itself. Thus, the human being in my own person is not at my disposal, so as to maim, corrupt, or kill him. Now this might be interesting because you might respond here and say, well, wait a minute. Fair enough, I can't use other people in that way. I can't dispose of another person's life to attain some other end. But why can't I do it to my own life? After all, don't I own my own person? Don't I own myself? And as a matter of fact, Kant says, you don't. Now this is not from our reading, this is from Kant's Lectures on Ethics, where he talks, he has one section of his Lectures on Ethics where he talks about prostitution. And here's what he says. He says, human beings have no right, therefore, to hand themselves over for profit, as things for another's use in satisfying the sexual impulse. For in that case, their humanity is in danger of being used by anyone as a thing, an instrument for the satisfaction of inclination. So Kant said, well, prostitution is morally wrong because you're making yourself into an object. You're making yourself into an object to satisfy another person's desires, another person's inclinations, and you're doing that in order to gain money. Now personally, I think there's a lot of questions here because one might say really the same thing about any job. You're using your body in a certain way to that provides a service to another person and getting money in return. It's not clear that it really matters when the service being provided is sex, as opposed to delivering the newspaper or running a Fortune 500 company. But in any case, going down that path would be a little bit too much of a rabbit hole. Kant did in fact think this about prostitution. Now whether he's right or wrong, one of the main takeaways we should see here is this. The moral ground for so holding is that man is not his own property and cannot do what as he pleases with his body. If you take seriously the idea that persons are not things, then your own person is not a thing. And if you're not a thing, then you can't own yourself. Because the only things you can own are things, are objects, are things of property. And so he says one cannot make one's own person a thing. This is why not only does the principle of humanity say you have to treat others in a respectful way, it also implies you have to treat yourself in a respectful way. And the foundation of the principle just is, we can never treat other people or ourselves as objects to attain a greater end. We have to treat others and ourselves as things with our own inherent intrinsic worth. Alright, so I will stop there with our overview of the principle of humanity, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.